Well, today we're modeling what may be one of the ugliest locomotives ever to roam the rails, right now here on the main track. Hey guys, welcome here to the main track. It's great to see you. My name is Mike and we appreciate you tuning in as always. Well, I've been working on a brand new locomotive for my layout, and as you can see here, I would say it's officially the most hideous looking unit I have on my roster now. But interestingly, it's also become one of my favorites only because this locomotive is so unique, and I'll explain that here right now. Of course, the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad was known for its bright, colorful locomotives in the green and yellow, and before the 1970s, they were red. So it's kind of interesting that a railroad with some of the most eye-catching trains at the time also had some of the ugliest units on rails. We'll take a look at this video shot by our friend Kenny Kaiser in Henry County, Missouri, around the town of Clinton back in the 1980s. We appreciate him letting us use these historic videos. Now, back in the early 1980s, when the MKT Railroad found itself needing some new locomotives, instead of buying brand new, it leased some second-hand units that were part of Conrail's fleet. Well, the MKT later purchased these outright. Some of them got repainted green, but as the mid-1980s progressed, the MKT found itself in merger talks with the Union Pacific system. So instead of spending the money to repaint the units, which would have just been repainted yellow, the MKT simply slapped some MKT patches on these and then blanked out the Conrail markings. Now, rewinding even more, a lot of Conrail's locomotives started life working for its predecessor, the Penn Central, which had a black color scheme. Most of those units were repainted from black into Conrail's blue colors in the 1970s. Well, that process took quite a while, so some of these units ran around in PC black, and Conrail simply blanked out the PC logos and slapped some CR letters on there, meant to be a temporary measure. Well, Conrail had not gotten around to repainting everything by the time MKT took ownership of these locomotives, and so these essentially became repatched units with the markings of Penn Central, Conrail, and MKT. As you can see, these things were not very pretty. Well, GP40 238 was the last to run in these black colors on the MKT roster until the time of the Union Pacific merger, which took place between 1988 and 1989. For most of my life, even going back to when I was a kid and I remember seeing the MKT, I always thought 238 was one of the most hideous locomotives I'd ever seen. And that still may be the case, but as time marches on, I've developed more of an appreciation for the way things were, whether we like it or not. Now for this project, I'll be using one of the new GP40s from ScaleTrains. Now I won't be doing a review per se because several other of our fellow YouTubers have done complete rundowns of these, so you want to check out those videos as well as ScaleTrains' website for a list of all the details. It's a pretty long list of features customized for the different road names offered. Now, this is actually my very first ScaleTrains locomotive, only because that company has not issued any road names that I've needed up until this point. Now, the GP40 in this run represents how the locomotives looked as built in 1968, so they would have changed quite a bit by the time MKT got a hold of these, so that means I'll have to add and remove some features to bring them up to date for the early 1980s. Now, here's a quick overview of how I MKTized this unit. Now, I modeled the summer of 1987, so I'll need to get this to look as close to that time period as I can. Now, first up is re-decaling. Now, I'm taking off the Penn Central logos on the front and back and replacing those with Conrail letters. Now, a quick note here, the lettering of the ScaleTrains units is pretty easy to take off. Now, what I do is take a piece of a paper towel and lay it over the spot I need to remove, and then soak it in Walther's Solvaset. And then after about 10 minutes, I remove the soaked paper and then dab the spot off. And so then I take a piece of Scotch tape and put it over the area and rub it down really good with a pencil or some other blunt object. You don't want anything too sharp because it'll cut through the tape and damage your locomotive. And from there, I lift the tape right off. In a perfect scenario, the lettering comes right up with it. Sometimes you have to repeat it 2 or 3 times to get it just right. Now, as for the CR lettering patch outs I have to put on the front and back of the locomotive, most Conrail decal sets I have the C and the R pretty close together. As you can see on number 238, those letters are farther apart, so I simply had to cut those and get that spacing just right before putting those on the locomotive. And as for the great big Penn Central logos on the long hood on both sides, I'm removing those and replacing them with this nice faded, roughed up version from CMR decals. Now for the cab numbers, I'm removing those on both sides. Now on the conductor's side, I'm putting on the original Penn Central number 3112, which I'll have to fade to represent the black patch out coming off over time and showing through. Now I'd hoped to have to just replace the 27 with 12 to save some time and effort, but I found the ScaleTrains letters and the microscale lettering were slightly different, so I had to redo the whole thing, which was fine. Well, on the engineer's side, the black patch out remained intact for the most part, so I didn't have to worry about putting that 3112 on this side. I will be putting the new KD 238 road number on both sides from Circus City decals. So then we add the green MKT patch with letters on the long hood over the Penn Central lettering. Well, these are also from Circus City. Well, the final touch for the decals was redoing the number boards and replacing the black Penn Central ones with the white ones that MKT installed. Now for this, I'm using microscale number board decals, and Circus City decals are for the numbers themselves. Now the number boards are lit, so when you put the decals over these, you're not going to get the backlit effect. That's perfectly fine for me because I don't make a habit of keeping my number board lights on when I'm running my locomotives, but you will want to keep that in mind. Now I used some black acrylic paint to rough up the Penn Central lettering a bit. Now bringing these up to date to the 1980s means adding and removing some details to replicate how they looked when they joined Katie's roster. Now there may need to be some more things that need to be done than what I'm highlighting here, but I'll be honest, I'm not a Penn Central or Conrail expert to know of all the minor differences for the time periods, so I'm simply looking at the major ones and replicating those. Now first up, I'm taking the running boards off the front and back pilot areas, and on the front I'll need to replace it with a plow, and for that I'm using a 3D printed unit I got from CMR. And now for the big old signal box, and I learned quite a bit about this. Now these harken back to a system on the old Pennsylvania Railroad, which was a Penn Central and Conrail predecessor, and that's where the signal aspects were shown on a display for the engineer up in the cab. Now that system was not on the Katie, but a lot of these former Conrail units could still be seen running around with these, although they were deactivated into the 1980s. Most of them were later removed. Now this needed to come off since it was no longer on number 238 by 1987. Well, I figured it would be just as easy as taking the signal box off of my Rapido Conrail GP38 units, which I recently retrofitted. Well, things were not so easy with the ScaleTrains unit. I was concerned when I encountered some resistance trying to pull it off, and then when it finally came off, this is what happened. Well, apparently ScaleTrains uses these big holes to mount their signal boxes to, and it kind of reminds me how 2 Lego pieces join up. So this brought me to a surprising conundrum with the big holes and body damage from where the box was glued on. Now here's the deal, having a box connected for the long haul is fine for the 99.99% of people using these units to actually model the Penn Central or Conrail, and they never plan to remove the box. But this, of course, was a hiccup for me. Well, I also accidentally snapped the handrail, which I had to fix. Well, thing is, at this particular time, I don't feel like filling in those holes with modeling putty and then sanding down and repainting it. So what I'm going to do is simply put this box on and leave it for now. I think it still looks fine. The thing is, the box was actually in place on the prototype up until the photos I've seen around 1985 or 1986. So I'm about 1 year off on that. Well, I do plan on eventually going back and tackling that project, getting that box off of there and filling in those holes, but it's not like the detail is several decades out of place, so I think it'll be fine for now. Well, a couple of more final touches. I added a flashing strobe to the top with some leftovers that I had from some Athearn units I'd worked on in years past. This is not operating at the moment, but I do plan on going back in there and wiring it up soon. Well, as you can also see, I went in there and added some sunshades to the cab roof. I did that with Details West parts. And I still have to weather the rest of the unit with grunge and grime, and you can see I've already started that in some spots. Standing back, I think this has turned out looking pretty bad so far, but in the best way possible and how it's supposed to look. Well, this project ended up being pretty fun for a variety of reasons, but namely, it kind of got me out of my box a little bit. I'm a big fan of Western and Midwestern railroads because that's where I'm from, and so I don't know a whole lot about the Eastern railroads, those like Conrail and Penn Central and Chessie System. So being able to research those railroads to get the details just right on this locomotive was pretty fun, and I certainly enjoyed that aspect of it. And so we'll get those final touches done, and you'll want to stay tuned to the channel here because you'll see that locomotive getting quite a bit of use here in the layout going forward. Well, how about you? Have you guys worked on any really neat locomotive detailing or maybe patch out projects lately? Tell me about those projects in the comments below, and I'll look forward to reading those. We'll see you next time right here on the main track.